All right. Can you guys see this? Like, can you see my screen?
If you guys could do like the reactions at the bottom of the screen, maybe. Okay.
All right. All right. So, welcome to the APR review. Um, like Will said, it's going to be recorded. So, turn your mics and cameras off. Well, you don't need to turn your cameras off just if you don't want to be recorded. Um, if you have any questions, it's up to you. You can either ask them when you have the question or you can wait until the end. It's completely up to you. So, semester one, you guys should have gone over Renaissance and exploration in the first unit, the Age of Reformation in the second unit, absolutism and constitutionalism in the third unit, and scientific, philosophical, and political developments in the fourth unit. So, unit one and two occur in between 1450 and 1848, and then unit three and four occur in between 1848 and 1915. And these are pretty important dates, and it's just good to know like the general times in which stuff is happening. I'll be going over unit one and two with you guys, and then we'll handle three and four. So, unit one is on Renaissance and exploration, and these are just some key concepts. Like, this isn't any like really specific details. This is just like the key concepts of this thing, such as like um, the rediscovery of works from ancient Greece and Rome. That's yeah, we'll go over that. Okay, so to start off, you have the philosophy, religion, and politics of the Italian Renaissance. So at the time of the Italian Renaissance, Italy was not unified. Um, the Medici family, who's pretty important, you guys should know them. Um, they got their wealth through banking and giving out loans and charging interest on those loans, which at the time was considered a sin through the church, but they kind of just put that aside and did it. Um, but by doing that, they helped spark the Renaissance in Italy, and the center became Florence, where they lived. Um, the European economy, like through all these banking families that were starting to appear, it moved away from feudal and like commoners. They had the ability to bring themselves out of being commoners and like become like economically and politically powerful. So some key Renaissance philosophers, you have Petrarch. He's considered the father of humanism, and he really put emphasis on secular learning, such as the study of like Greco and Roman classics. Um, just in the Renaissance in general, there was a huge revival of the study of um, Greece and Roman like science and literature and everything. Another philosopher, Lorenzo Valla, he was inspired by Petrarch, and so a big thing he did was he proved the donation of Constantine was a fake. The donation of Constantine was a document that said that um, what was it? It was like a biblical document that gave power to the Pope, and Lorenzo Valla proved that that was a fake, which took some power away from the church. Christine de Pizan, she was an early feminist. She argued against misogyny. Um, Leon Battista Alberti, he was an architecture, Roman and Greek designs, so another secular learning and the study of classics. Machiavelli, who's pretty important. He was the father of political science. He was kind of one of the first guys to like put importance on the separation of politics and religion, so the separation of state and church. And then you have Castiglione, who wrote the Book of the Courtier, and that describes the ideal characteristics and behavior of a Renaissance man or woman. So something important is ecclesiasticism versus humanism, so or scholasticism. So the difference between those two is scholasticism is knowledge controlled by the church or clergy. It was a focus on biblical study and knowledge developed from that, while humanism was a study of past literature and poetry and getting knowledge from that, such as stuff written by ancient Greeks and Romans. So scholasticism is based on religion, and humanism is more secular. Neoplatonism is the revival and the study of Plato's teaching and work, um, and reconcile them with Christianity. Um, some writers believe that Plato is divinely inspired and that his philosophy and Christianity could be combined into be like one like better religion. Um, one of their main points was free will, and like that everyone was given free will and these natural born rights, and that would develop into individualism, which would have a huge impact on the future. So, popes and politics. Towards the beginning of the Italian Renaissance, the Great Schism ended, and so the Pope came back to Rome. And the Pope sort of transferred from focusing on religion to focusing on politics and art in the Renaissance. So Alexander the Sixth, he held lavish parties, killed a few people, had a few papal nephews, which the Pope wasn't supposed to have relations with women or have children. And so when they did, they just called them their nephews and said that they were somehow related to them and kind of ignore them, but they were their sons. They just illegitimate. And also, most of the popes at this time were pretty corrupt. Julius II, he was known as the warrior pope. He led some armies, but he also financed a ton of art pieces like the Sistine Chapel. So a lot of the popes at this time, they would put money into art, which would popularize themselves. Leo X, he was part of the Medici family, and he spent the entire Vatican treasury in 1 year, and he began the practice of selling indulgences. Now, selling indulgences would become very important, as it would lead people like Martin Luther to become upset with the church and then branch off and create their own religions. Um, the art of the Italian Renaissance. So, banking brought wealth to families, which led to patronage, where these families would pay these artists to make art for them. And same thing with the Pope. The Pope would and the church would pay people to make art for them. Um, this is an improvement sort of from medieval art, because in the medieval times people wouldn't be paid that much to make that art, but now they were being paid more so they could develop their skill because they could make a living off that art. So medieval art was primarily religious, didn't have that much perspective and was pretty unnatural, versus Renaissance being religious and secular and lots of perspective and natural sources of light and shadowing. And also they embraced Greek and Roman sort of art styles, which was very different from medieval times. The Northern Renaissance and Christian humanism. Now, the Northern Renaissance started about a century after the Italian Renaissance, and this one was more focused on religion and ending corruption in the church. It was that Renaissance started mostly because of the Black Plague, war, corruption in the church, and just like peasants and commoners started drifting away from the church, and people saw that and they wanted to end that corruption in the church. So John Wycliffe, he was a early reformer Renaissance man. He said that the Bible is authority and that the Pope shouldn't have any authority, and his followers, the Lollards, were persecuted. Gutenberg, he invented the printing press, which is extremely important throughout history. It perfected movable type printing around 1450. And of course, one of the first things they printed was the Bible. Vernacular printing spread, and it spread info and literacy throughout Europe. Erasmus, he was a writer, he wanted to reform the church, and he said that the church has lost sight of his goals. And then people that were similar to him, Thomas More, he wrote Utopia, which was based upon an ideal society. And like Erasmus, he wanted reform. However, he didn't want the church to split. Another notable person was Jan Hus. He was also against the splitting of the church, and he had religion based upon the scripture, so only the Bible. And he questioned the Pope and was executed as a heretic because of it. On to next thing, new monarchies, the development of the nation state. So First, we have Jean Bodin. Um, he was sort of the first guy to argue for sovereignty, which is ruling with no outside interference. However, without outside interference, the ruler has to be fair. So at the time, England was stable under the Tudors. France had power consolidated under the Valois, and then Spain was unified by marriage, which we'll get to later. So the main differences between feudal kingdoms and new monarchies is in feudal, you had peasants who were taxed by nobles, and then those nobles gave money to their kings. So it was a very like pyramid structure. And the nobles protected the kings, and the kings gave the nobles land. For new monarchies, however, um, towns and peasants were taxed. So, and nobles gave funds to the king, but it was less structured and more like free for all, I guess you could say. And also, kings had professional standing armies for protection instead of the nobles, and they started to create their own administrations with educated professionals. So it's like they're relying less on the nobles and the church and relying more on themselves and hired help. So in England, we have Henry the Seventh. He used the Star Chamber, which you guys have probably heard about. Pretty important to punish the nobles against the king. Now, the reason it's important is because this centralized the power. So nobles against the king, they were punished, and so all that power that the nobles had, he brought that into himself. He established a navy for protection of himself and created a system of judges under him that maintained law in place of the nobles. So what he's really trying to do is take power away from the nobles and bring it into himself and like the people directly under him. We have Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. They united the 6 different kingdoms of Spain through marriage unition and, of course, force. Um, to centralize power, they reduced the numbers of nobles on their council and instead put educated professionals at their service as advisors. They reinstated the Spanish Inquisition. Well, they brought the Inquisition from the church to the Spanish government, so they took control of it um, because they wanted Catholic religious unity. Because if their entire nation was one religion, then it would be easier to control. So more power for them. This Inquisition included mass torture of anyone not suspected to be Catholic, and it was mainly focused on Spanish Jews. So a lot of them migrated to Central Europe, like France, the Netherlands, what will become Germany, and other parts of Europe. The significance of these new monarchies, they showed that feudalism no longer worked, like as they were the new system that began to emerge, and um, most of Europe would transfer into this system, and then like eventually they would split off into different stuff. But for now, they were transferring or like shifting from feudalism to new monarchies. They consolidated power, so they really focused on reducing the power of the nobles, like Henry VII in England, and centralizing their governments. So this is, of course, the foundation of the modern nation state that we have today. Nobles slowly lose their power to the royal families of Europe, and monarchs get military, taxation, and the economy under their control. Now on to exploration and colonization. So the Renaissance, changes in religion, population growth, new monarchies, new trade routes, and mercantilism all inspired the exploration and colonization. Mercantilism was a popular economic theory at this time. It was pretty flawed. It stated that there was a fixed amount of wealth in the world, and that sorry, there's a fixed amount of wealth in the world, and that in order for one country to get richer, another one had to get poorer. So this created inflation in some places, but also the Black Plague caused inflation. Um, yeah. So early exploration and colonization included the Crusades. They were a fail, but they opened Europe's mind to new things in Asia, like spices and cultures, religions, other things. Marco Polo, he went around in Asia, and he wrote back to Europe, and he told of Asian wealth. And of course, this sparked interest in finding new trade routes to Asia, which was the basis for a lot of exploration and colonization. So first we have Portugal. At first, it was controlled by the Moors or Muslim family in the Middle Ages, but they were forced out. Um, they were forced to trade by sea due to isolation because they were kind of bordered by Spain. They couldn't really go by land. So they used Muslim navigation techniques. Prince Henry the Navigator, he was a member of Portuguese royalty, and he wanted to find a sea route to Asia. He explored the west coast of Africa, and he created a navigation school, which would later teach Columbus. The Portuguese focused mainly on finding an eastern route to China. They didn't really focus on going west at this time. Um, one of their significant explorers was Vasco da Gama. He sailed all the way around Africa and made it all the way to India. Next up, we have Spain. Spain, like Portugal, was under Muslim rule until Ferdinand and Isabella expelled Muslim rulers from southern Spain in 1492. At that time, Spain was pretty much broke. They didn't have a very strong economy, and mercantilism, that theory they had, made Portugal a threat to them because at the time Portugal was richer, and they thought, oh, Portugal's gonna make us poor so they can get more rich. Spain took a chance with Columbus. They funded Columbus's voyage. Now, I'm sure most of you guys know Columbus. He miscalculated the Earth's size. He thought that he could sail west to reach India, but instead he landed in Bahamas and he started calling the people Indians, which was the origin of that, but they weren't Indians. So from there, you have Spain, who discovered the New World. And Portugal heard that they found the New World, and there was a dispute over who got these lands. Portugal basically bribed the Pope at the time to give them the lands in the east, which they thought were going to be better, and give Spain the land in the west. And at that time, Portugal thought that that was good, but in reality, Spain got the better segment of land. They got like Mexico and all of that, or what's Mexico today. But this treaty wasn't even recognized by other European countries, and they made claims to North America. And that's known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. So, like I said before, the most European countries didn't recognize the Treaty of Tordesillas. And so France, they went and made claims in modern Canada, central US. England would go on to take modern northeast US and southern US. The Dutch would go to modern central US. Spain would go to control pretty much all of Latin America except for Brazil, and then Portugal would control exclusively Brazil. Now, the European center of wealth, which had previously been in Florence and Italy because of the banking families and the Renaissance and all the art there, it shifted because of these new lands towards Atlantic European countries. So London and Bristol in England, Antwerp in the Netherlands, and Cadiz in Spain, they all became centers of wealth in Europe. And this brought about the price or commercial revolution. So because these new goods and this new wealth that shifted towards the Atlantic state, new industries like the banking industry, shipping industry, weapons manufacturing, textile clothing, and other industries developed. And that would help, that revolution just changed how these economies looked. Conquering and colonization. So this is mostly Spain. They were the big conquerors. They had the 3 Gs: gold, God, and glory. They wanted to spread their religion. They wanted to find gold. And of course, you had the big thing of nationalism, which was power, which was kind of influenced by mercantilism, because if you're the bigger country, then you're probably the richer country. So you have the Aztec in Mexico. Cortez, he came in and he only had a few guys and a few guns, but decimated the Aztecs because of disease and like the belief that they were superior because they had armor and stuff. So pretty much the entirety of Mexico became Spanish by 1550, or was under the control of Mexico, or was under the control of Spain by 1550. You had pretty much the same story in Peru with the Inca, and then Pizarro came in and conquered them. And so what you have here is the start of the Columbian Exchange. which was the transfer of animals, plants, diseases, and even slaves, which will come on later, between Europe and the Americas. So, because of Spain's massive gain of land in the New World, they became a new political powerhouse in Europe, like along with other ones like France and England at the time. So in the New World, Spain set up the encomienda system. This was essentially slavery. It was forced labor of colonists and natives. This wouldn't do very well as disease killed off most of the native population, which was their labor force. However, Portugal at the time had begun to use African slaves, and Spain quickly joined them. And of course, then everybody else joined them, and that led to the rise of slavery. Most slaves were at first used on sugar plantations, but after a few years, they were used for all labor. Between the 16th and 19th century, 10 million Africans were shipped to America as slaves. So you have the influx of gold, silver, and riches from the New World. That will have an effect of inflation on the European economy. So the price revolution, like that's the shifting and like the new economies in Europe. You have new products and diseases that are introduced to, well, new products that are introduced to Europe, and mostly new diseases that are introduced to America. So the Columbian Exchange, native populations, of course, ravaged by disease and labor, and of course forced out of their lands. And then to replace that labor, you have African slavery. Mercantilism and colonialism will lead to increased rivalries between the great powers of Europe. So you have Spain and Portugal fighting over power of land in the New World, and then you'll eventually see other fights for land. So that was the majority of Unit 1. Just to focus on religion, exploration. Well, for this one, we get into more religion and kind of the split off of Catholicism. So one of the first major guys to split off from Catholicism was Martin Luther. So at the time, because of the Renaissance, people began to call for reformation in the Catholic Church. Black Death, church corruption, greed, and the selling of indulgences, and the printing press, which spread information. They all showed people that like the Catholic Church wasn't what it was supposed to be to a lot of people. Among priests and bishops, you had pluralism, which was like they would take multiple jobs and like multiple positions in the church, which you weren't supposed to do. And then absenteeism, which they basically just wouldn't show up to any of the churches. They would just get paid and have that power, which was another reason they called for Reformation. So Martin Luther, he writes the 95 Theses, which basically oppose the selling of indulgences and expresses the need for reform in the Catholic Church. So they basically ignore it, and so he splits off and forms Lutheranism, which is similar to Catholicism, but there's only two sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist, which is communion. His new religion that he created, pretty much spread all throughout the Holy Roman Empire. So after that, you had peasant revolts, which were inspired by this new religion and other revolutions. They demanded more rights from feudal lords. Like the peasants felt that they weren't getting equal or like the treatment they deserved, that they were getting overtaxed and stuff, and because of the church and everything. Luther, he set up his position so that he was against the peasants. He was on the side of the lords, the princes, and so he gained their support, which would further help spread Lutheranism. You have the Schmalkaldic War, which was the early war of religion. Charles V, who was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire at the time, he demanded that it remain Catholic. But you have those princes who Luther supported in the peasant revolts, and they supported his religion, Lutheranism. So you have that war that goes on, and it culminates in the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. So that was a victory for Protestantism. as the prince get to choose the religion in their region. So the the Holy Roman Empire remained intact at the time, and the sorry, um, the Holy Roman Empire remained intact, and the princes got to choose the religion they got in their region. So I forget what it says. It's like ius religio quios religio. Um, sorry. So you have Lutheranism, obviously, that was the front runner of Protestant Christianity, but at sort of the same period in other areas, you had other deviations from Catholicism. So in Switzerland, you have Zwingli. He was early. It was similar to Luther, but he didn't think that baptism and communion were necessary for salvation. He thought that they were just like rituals that you didn't really need. And unlike Luther, he sided with the peasants and the peasant revolts, which was detrimental to the popularity of his religion because the princes didn't support it. Calvin, he was in Switzerland. He was also influenced by Luther, but he developed more of his own beliefs and he became a leader of the Reformation in Switzerland. He developed Calvinism, which was similar to Lutheranism, but they believed in predestination, which a lot of people liked about Calvinism. And also they believed in religion over state. So they believed that the church was more important than the government. They set up a very strict legal system in Switzerland, which was basically like no playing cards and no dancing. Um, Calvinism spreads. So in France, you have the Huguenots. They're going to be important later. In Scotland, you have the Presbyterians. England, you have the Puritans who would become the Pilgrims that go to America. And then Netherlands, the Calvinism or the Calvins that spread there, Calvinists that spread there, they would spark a Dutch Reformation. Calvinism spread to Austria and Poland, but that was wiped out later in the Catholic Counter Reformation, which we'll get to. Finally, you have Anabaptist reformers. They were the most radical out of all of them. There were small uprisings of them all over Europe. They believed in adult baptism because children lacked the ability to choose their religion. They also believed in the separation of state and church, and they members of their religion helped lead the peasant revolts. So up next we have the English Reformation. King Henry VIII wanted a male heir, and because of that, he believed his current wife couldn't give him one, and so he wanted a divorce from her. The Catholic Church would not allow him, so Henry split off from the Catholic Church and made a new Church of England, which was led by the king himself. So through this, he seized church land and wealth, and he put that land up for sale to wealthy nobles and stuff. So this increased the power of the monarchy, which shows that he was creating a new monarchy. After King Henry passed, Edward took over, and he allowed Protestant ideas in England, but that was only briefly because he passed, and then Mary took over, and she did not allow Protestant ideas. She reinstated Catholicism and persecuted and executed Protestants. So she tried to bring back Catholicism. And then after her, you had Elizabeth, who came in, and she made the Church of England. And Elizabeth is an important ruler because she compromised between Catholicism and Protestantism. It was kind of a hybrid religion. They had compared to Catholicism, which did their services in Latin. They didn't have saints, and the clergy could marry, but other than that, it was pretty much the same as Catholicism. So sort of after that, you had going on sort of during that, you had the Catholic Counter Reformation. So in response to Luther, Well, so the popes knew what was going on with Luther. They know that people were splitting off and that like smaller religions were getting bigger and bigger. At first, they ignored it, like up until 1530. Then they defended against it in 1560, which you'll see. And then after that, they sort of became forward looking, proactive, and looked for ways to kind of compromise and bring them back together. So Pope Leo X, he was the Pope when Luther broke off. And then after him, you had Adrian VI, who started reform efforts very briefly, but he passed away. So he saw them, like he saw the people who broke off, and he saw what they wanted, and he started those reform efforts, but he passed away before he could really put them into motion. After him, you had Clement the 7th, I think. Yeah. He was sort of like Leo the 10th. There was no attempts at reform. He basically ignored it. Um, he was, however, a great patron of the arts. And then after that, you have Paul the 3rd, who was really the first Counter Reformation Pope. He defended the church, reinstated the Inquisition. He made the Jesuits, and he made the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent was pretty important. They had 3 sessions. The first 2 sessions were kind of defensive of the Catholic Church. They were trying to sort of break down Lutheranism and all those other religions and bring people back. It wasn't until the 3rd session, the last one, where they really started to make those compromises and changes that people wanted to see. They established seminaries, which meant that the priests and bishops they had to sort of go to classes and become educated. And also the bishops were forced to visit the churches. So that eliminated absenteeism. However, there was no mention of papal reform, which was very needed. Um, so, like I said before, Paul III also established the Jesuit order. The Jesuits were well educated, disciplined, and they were set on the revival of Catholicism. Um, they were able to reconvert most of South Germany and Poland to Catholicism. So this was a big win for Catholicism. The Jesuits spread across Europe, and one like long lasting important thing they did was they established schools. Like they set up ways for kids to get education all across Europe. And something they did was they didn't allow exclusively Catholics, they allowed students of any religion, which was great. So now we're going to get into Spain. Philip II, well, more the Holy Roman Empire. So Charles V, he split the Holy Roman Empire, sort of like his land between his son Philip II and his brother Ferdinand. So Philip got Spain, the Netherlands, and portions of Italy, and Ferdinand got the most of the Holy Roman Empire. So the Habsburg Empire was pretty much split from now on between the two. Under Philip II, Spain went on a Catholic crusade. So he wanted to reimpose Catholicism pretty much across Europe, but primarily his own land. So the Netherlands, Spain, and his parts of Italy. So of course his main focus was the Netherlands because that was his land, and so he went on crusades there to try and reconvert them to Catholicism because at the time the Dutch were mostly Protestant. And so, in retaliation to this, the Dutch revolted and they gained independence with the help of England under Elizabeth I. England decided to help the Dutch because the Netherlands were close to England, and Elizabeth feared that if the Netherlands was converted to Catholicism, that's like Philip would launch an invasion of England from the nearby Netherlands. This was detrimental to Philip's goal of reinstating Catholicism in his empire, obviously, because the Netherlands, which he still considered part of his empire, were not Catholic. He, like Elizabeth feared, he planned to invade England using the Spanish Armada, which at the time was the largest naval force. Elizabeth and Sir Francis Drake, sorry, they secured the English victory in 1588. So Philip had sent the Spanish Armada to invade England, and England had successfully defended. This was great for English nationalism. Um, England is now considered a major power, and this nationalism helped them explore, and like they felt comfortable being out on the sea because the Spanish Armada wasn't a threat anymore. So they went across and they began to develop American colonies. This also marked the beginning of the Spanish decline, which was basically the Spanish had reached the peak of their power, and now their power would just decrease and their wealth would decrease. Up next, you have the French Civil War and the French Wars of Religion. Well, same thing. Um, so in France at the time, you had, or the ruling family was the Valois. I don't know how you say it. You had Henry II. He was the last sort of powerful king. He had a few sons, but his wife Catherine de Medici, she was the real. She had all the power at the time. So you have these two sides, the Guise leading the Catholics in the north, and the Bourbons leading the Huguenots in the south. So the Bourbons are Protestant and the Guise are Catholic. Um, they were both fighting for the royal inheritance. So because Catherine de Medici was the powerful person, she basically decided who would get the royal inheritance, and so they were having a fight over that. So at first, Catherine had supported the Catholics, the Guises, in the first phase. Um, you had the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre, which was basically the slaughter of a ton of Huguenots. Um, However, Henry of Navarre survived, and he was a Huguenot. Um, and then throughout the Civil War, Catherine ended up switching sides and supported the Bourbons, the Huguenots, and Henry of Navarre, who had survived the massacre. He became their leader and helped defeat the Catholic League, which was the Guises, and he became the King of France. So this the outcome of the Civil War was France was still divided by religion. There, just because the Huguenots won, um, it wasn't the primary religion, so it was pretty much divided between Catholicism and Protestantism. The royal powers weakened, and the Valois family was replaced by the Bourbon family. Um, this ended Spanish interference in France, and he became Catholic to compromise and pass the Edict of Nantes to grant religious rights to Huguenots. So you didn't have complete religious freedom in France, but they had a balance between Catholicism and Protestantism. Next, you have the 30 Years' War. It was fought in the Holy Roman Empire between Catholics and Protestants, but throughout the war, it evolved from religion into a war for power between the Habsburg family and the Bourbon family. It was resolved by the Peace of Westphalia, and France and Sweden basically joined forces against the Holy Roman Empire because of religion, but they seized the opportunity to weaken the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburgs. So you have multiple phases of this war. First, you have the Bohemian phase. Frederick V became the king in Bohemia, and he fought Ferdinand II over religion because Frederick V wanted Catholicism, but they wanted sort of religious freedom. Or sorry, Ferdinand II wanted Catholicism. Frederick V wanted religious freedom. So Frederick lost land and he lost his kingdom in Bohemia, but what he did would inspire other rebellions. The Danish phase, Danish King Christian the Third or Fourth led Protestant resistance. Protestantism was defeated, so it was a victory for Catholicism. And then Ferdinand II passed the Edict of Restitution, which restored all Catholic land lost since 1552. So basically, the Holy Roman Empire is declaring that everything that was once Catholic was now theirs again. This effectively undid the Peace of Augsburg. Um, so now they declared that everyone had to be Catholic and that the princes couldn't declare the religion in their region. And this caused fear of the Holy Roman Empire from the princes. Then you had the Swedish phase. So this is when France and Sweden got involved to stop the growing Habsburg power. Gustavus Adolphus, he's pretty important. He was a Swedish military genius. He um, he helped Sweden become a first-rate power, so on par with France and Spain. Um, and he invaded the Holy Roman Empire, but his advance was stopped and defeated. However, this was pretty detrimental to the Holy Roman Empire and Catholicism because they barely won. So it's like barely a victory for Catholicism in this phase. And then finally, you had the French phase. And so this was France's turn to lead the attack. This is really when the war, the 30 Years' War, transferred from religion to weakening the Habsburgs. So, and in this phase, pretty much all countries in Europe participated. Um, the war ends pretty much when Ferdinand II dies, and after that, peace negotiations begin. Um, the French phase was most destructive. It led to famine, inflation, widespread death, and pretty much crippled the trade economy in Europe at the time. So the 30 Years' War comes to end, and there's negotiations, and they come up with the Peace of Westphalia. So German princes became free from the Holy Roman Empire. So they got to decide religion now. They weren't loyal to the Holy Roman Empire anymore. The Dutch and Netherlands got independence. Sweden got lands in northern Germany. Switzerland became an independent. Brandenburg, which participated in the war, they got some territories in what would become Germany. Um, the Calvinists, they obtained the same privilege as Lutherans in the Peace of Augsburg. So basically, princes could have that as an option for religion if they wanted. But now people in those regions had a freedom of private worship, so they could worship whatever they wanted in private. Um, Now it seems good, but there was still widespread discontent, like unhappiness, because of the destruction and death the war caused. And this war would be blamed for a lot of future problems and wars that would happen in Europe. Something of importance to remember was that this was the last major war of religion. All of the future wars were more about the balance of power and nationalism or imperialism. And Europe had come together, like most of European countries had come together to solve this problem of religion. Now the Holy Roman Empire existed more by name than by like power, and this would allow for the rise of new states like Prussia, which would later become Germany. One of the last things is the English monarchy and the Civil War. So in 1215, you had the Magna Carta, which King John was forced to accept. This was pretty popular among the people, as now there had to be popular consent for taxes and jury by trial. So that was just basic rights for the English people. Parliament had been set up. King Edward brought military leaders and nobility together to ask for taxes. So in that, King Edward kind of bypassed the Magna Carta, as now he only had to ask those military leaders and nobility, which were close to him and also wealthy, for those taxes. You had the Elizabethan bargain, in which was basically the split of power, which would come towards the end, in which Parliament got the ability to tax and then debate and amend bills, and the monarch controlled foreign policy. So that wouldn't come until then. So this is basically a summary of the war. So the Stuarts, James I, Charles I, they came from Scotland and they inherited the English throne after Elizabeth. James I and Charles I, they clashed with Parliament. Historically, like they had set it up so that Parliament had the power to tax, not the king, but they wanted to change that and they wanted the king to have the power to tax. The gentry and the wealthy commoners demand protection of Parliament's taxation right. Many of them are Puritans or Calvinists. These Puritans wanted to move the Anglican Church away from Catholic roots. Um, Charles I raised taxes without any parliament's consent. Um, this seemed like the Petition of Right and the ship money assessments. And so, in response, civil wars declared between the Parliament and King Charles I. King Charles I is defeated and beheaded, and then Parliament now began to rule England without a king. And so that's pretty much all of Unit 1 and 2. Yeah, so I'll hand it off to Will now.
All right, thank you, Ethan. That was magnificent. I'll share my screen and we'll get going with units 3 and 4. Thank you guys for sticking through. I know this is long and probably not your first thing that you would want to do today, but it's really important that you guys are doing it, and you guys will do just fine on your final. All right, so can you guys see that all right? Ethan? All right. So it should almost be full screen by now. Once it gets there, can you guys let me know if it's up there? Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
All right, so now we're into the period of absolutism and constitutionalism. So this is from 1648 CE to 1815 CE. Just take a quick moment to really look over these key concepts, because it's kind of the basis of units 3, 4, and 5. You haven't gotten on unit 5 yet. So just have these in the back of the mind, or your mind. Yeah, I know Mr. Spears he really likes them. All right, so we'll go on. So the first thing that happens is really the Dutch Golden Age, which is from 1600 to 1700. So as Ethan said, the Dutch gained independence from Spain in the Treaty of Westphalia. So there was no absolute ruler, which is really unique at the time. And it was an oligarchy of wealthy merchants with provincial influence from common people. So there was a lot of influence from the common people, which was remarkable at the time. And they really put the economy and business like before anything religious. I forget what someone said, but someone said that like the Dutch care more about business than they do God or something. So some of the causes of this was like a rise in shipbuilding. So they sent over like 2,000 ships worldwide. And the Dutch East Indies Company, they replaced Portugal. And so we saw the rise of these joint stock companies, which would be the basis for stock exchanges. Like modern ones would be the New York Stock Exchange. And Amsterdam was really this economic center with the Amsterdam Exchange Bank and the stock exchange. And we see a rise of capitalism. So capitalism is basically reinvesting your wealth in order to acquire more wealth. So let's say you get paid a certain salary, then you put that salary into maybe your own business that you want to start. That's kind of the basis of capitalism. We'll get more into that later though. So in the Dutch Golden Age, we have kind of the Golden Age also of Dutch art. And at the time, by the way, the Netherlands was called the Dutch Republic. So the decline of the Dutch Republic, it was caused by a series of costly wars with England and France. So they actually won most of their battles, but it just ended up being way too much money. And France actually ended up occupying part of their territory for a while, and it was extremely expensive to win back. And so Britain tried to sabotage the Dutch Republic with the Navigation Act. So that made all of Britain's allies only trade with Britain instead of both Britain and the Netherlands. So this was like the American economy, the US, which was the colonies at the time. They only traded with Britain, and that was a big kind of thing at the time. And so there's also tariffs to protect their own industry against the Dutch. And the French dominated luxurious items, and Britain began mass producing textiles. And so Dutch art in the Golden Age, it was not religious. So it was really funded by private and public institutions, not as much religious institutions. So we have a lot of focus on individuals, groups, landscapes, and everyday life. So here's a few examples. We have the girl with the pearl earring. That's very famous nowadays. The milkmaid, the night watch, and the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp. So it's always good to know a few examples. Um, so yeah, that's Dutch art. All right. So now we're moving into England. So they also have an alternative to absolutism like the Dutch. So we see the rise of the gentry or the middle class in England. So these are landowners that aren't wealthy enough to be in the upper class. But so the thing that's really interesting about these people is that they're willing to pay taxes. And so that would mean that there would be a smaller load of taxes on the commoners. And so they advocated for their power in the House of Commons, which was with the House of Lords and Parliament. So they're majority Calvinist, and the Stuart dynasty had just taken over, and they wanted more monarchical power, and this made a lot of conflict with Parliament. For instance, James I, he was very, I don't know how you'd say it, but he believed in divine right, and he wanted bishops, but it conflicted with Parliament. And Charles I was also very into divine right. He made the Petition of Right in 1628. No one taxed without Parliament's consent, and no one imprisoned without due process. So Parliament made him sign it, but so he tried making a new Catholic Church, and he had to call Parliament eventually for the war against the Scots in Scotland. And this allowed the discussion of key issues in Parliament because he hadn't held Parliament in a long time. All right. And so after that, we see the English Civil War, which lasted from 1642 to 1649. And the Cavaliers remained loyal to the king and they favored the monarchy, while the Roundheads, they favored Parliament and often the common people. This is an example of a Roundhead soldier. They got the name from the helmet. And so the Roundheads were led by Oliver Cromwell, which is in this picture. He won the war and they executed Charles I. All right, so Oliver Cromwell is a big figure in English history. So he started the Commonwealth in 1649, and he just obliterated Irish royalists and Catholics, which is still controversial to this day. And he actually instituted the Navigation Act, and that main goal was to prevent Dutch power. He abolished the House of Lords and became the Lord Protector. That was his title. And so he died in 1658. Parliament actually invited Charles I's son to power, who was very reluctant to give power to these gentry and common people. And so the Restoration restored the monarchy. Charles was Catholic and the Whigs were against Charles, while the Tories were for Charles. So this is kind of the first political parties. This is important. You're going to want to remember this. And so James II, which is Charles II's son, wanted to make England Catholic, which antagonized all sides, the Whigs and Tories. So we see the Glorious Revolution. So James II, he married a Protestant and had a child, Mary, who was Protestant, and he was married to William of Orange of the Netherlands or the Dutch Republic. And so the Whigs and Tories, they both invited William of Orange to take over England, and James II fled, and revolution was completely bloodless. This is a really big moment in both English history and European history because it's completely bloodless. And so William of Orange signed the English Bill of Rights because he didn't really care about England. So he's just saying, you know, whatever, I'll sign this. And so that gave English people a lot of new privileges that they didn't enjoy before. And so we see a few new philosophers throughout this era. So we see Thomas Hobbes. He wrote the book Leviathan, and he said the humans are prone to violence and selfishness, kind of greed. So natural existence, people knew no peace or security. So that's why he advocated for government. He said it's a great thing. People concede some liberty to attain security. He didn't originally come up with the social contract, but we'll see the more development in the social contract later on in history. And he wanted to avoid anarchy at all costs, which is no government at all. And so we see another one. His name is John Locke. He wrote the Second Treatise of Government. He inspired Thomas Jefferson, which, as you all know, is one of the main inspirations behind the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So people were products of their experiences. He was more, I guess, environmental influence in the environment versus or nature versus nurture. So he advocated for the natural rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of property in, how do they say it, in America. And the governments exist only to preserve people's rights, and they should remain as small as possible. And so the right to revolt if rights are infringed. So this was pretty big, and it was considered radical at the time. That's pretty important. So we just have the general idea of state building throughout this unit. So it's the struggle for sovereignty within and among states resulted in varying degrees of political centralization. Like, for example, in the Dutch Republic, we see very little political centralization, no absolutism, and even some opinions of the common people in government. So the new idea of sovereign states and secular authority, it had influence. And so the monarchs fought for power with their corporations, minorities, and nobles. We see a lot of linguistic minorities start to gain power. For example, the Magyars in Hungary, um, which was in the Holy Roman Empire, they'll eventually be important. And so the different models of political sovereignty, it really affected the relationship among states and between states and individuals. So we saw the rise of this political system called absolutism, and it was really popular in most of the European powers throughout the 17th and 18th century. So we have challenges to absolutism that gave rise to new political systems like in England and the Dutch Republic. So yeah, first of all, let's talk about absolutist France. So we began the transition into absolutism under Henry IV of Henry, or also known as Henry of Navarre. I don't know how to say that. I don't take French, but so it was continued by Louis XIII, Cardinal Richelieu, Louis XIV, and all stresses politics over religion. So Henry IV wrote the Edict of Nantes. He appointed Duc de Sully to make taxation efficient. And he made the nobility of the sword and the nobility of the robe, which was kind of like the House of Commons and the House of I'm blanking on the name right now, but the two houses of parliament in England at the time. It's really similar to that. And you could buy government positions, which was important. And so Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu, so they both ruled in effect until 1642. The intendant system was to weaken the nobility and weaken the Habsburgs. So they fought with the Protestants in the 30 Years' War. And so this important revolutionary movement called the Fronde, it happened after Richelieu died. And so the nobles sensed weakness in the government and led a coup d'etat. And Louis XIV was forced to flee Paris. That's important in the next slide. So Louis XIV, we know as the Sun King because he was very powerful. He was the most powerful in France ever. So he was empowered by Bishop Bossuet, and he argued for divine right also. So he really weakened the nobility, and his main thing was l'état c'est moi. I don't know if I said that right. If you're in French, you're probably cringing right now, but that means I am the state. So he built the Palace Versailles, which was a little bit away from Paris because what I said, why it was important that he had to leave Paris, because he remembered the Fronde and he made the palace away from Paris so that he wouldn't be subject to the dangers of Paris and the commoners. So yeah, we see Jean-Baptiste Colbert. He was appointed as an economic advisor. He was a very strict mercantilist. He advocated for colonies, protective tariffs, and he didn't make taxes more equitable. And they together revoked the Edict of Nantes, which prevented religious toleration from developing. So we have another war, the War of Spanish Succession. So Louis XIV, he wanted to inherit the Habsburg power in Spain, which was very upsetting to everyone else in Europe because they wanted to maintain the balance of power. So Louis invaded the Dutch Republic many times, and each time that he tried, it was stopped by a coalition of countries against France, like Britain, Prussia, and other countries. So the Grand Alliance was composed of the Dutch, Austria-Brandenburg, which is Prussia, would later be known as Prussia, Italian Duchy of Savoy, and more. So the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, it ended the war and established balance of power for the next 30 years. So Philip V allowed the King of Spain if France and Spain did not unite, and France got Alsace, England got naval bases in Spain and the slave trade from Spain, the asiento, and he got French territory in Canada, which is important for the American colonies. And so Austria got Spanish Netherlands and parts of Italy. And I believe the Spanish Netherlands will soon be Belgium in modern history. And the Duke of Savoy became a king. So he is the king of Savoy now, and he traded Austria for Sardinia. And the Elector of Brandenburg was recognized as the king of Prussia. So here we'll start to see the rise of Prussia. They're going to be an extremely powerful military country. So again, we see the decline of Spain. So through Ferdinand and Isabella, they really built Spain up from the base, and they built the golden age of Spain, and it started to decline in the 1600s. So the economic decline was as a result of the expulsion of Jews and Muslims, along with the Spanish Inquisition. They expelled a lot of people from the country in the name of Christianity, and the surplus of gold and silver from South America and North America. Initially, that was a really good thing because it brought in a lot of wealth, but it also created a lot of inflation that made the value of gold and silver go down. So there's a lot of costly wars and a decline of commerce, agriculture, and population as a result of a lot of things. So the political decline, there was a series of really weak rulers. So the rulers and aristocrats led very lavish lives that everyone knew that they couldn't afford. And there was just a ton of numerous military defeats. And again, the costly wars, costly defeats. All right, so one thing is Eastern Europe we don't talk about a lot. So the Holy Roman Empire, the Republic of Poland, and Ottoman Empire are all declining. And the Holy Roman Empire, so the 30 Years' War, it left it religiously divided, politically divided into 300 states. No imperial army, revenues, or central authority. So the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns, they emerged as the rulers of Austria and Prussia, respectively, which would later be known as the German states. And the Republic of Poland, the government was run by an elected king. The nobles had arguably more power than the king. They had extreme influence in government, and that's what led to the eventual partition of Poland, and that's why Poland never really gained a lot of power. And so the Ottoman Empire threatened the Holy Roman Empire's Vienna throughout history, multiple times in history, and it eventually repelled from Vienna by Austria, Poland, and Germans. And the empire declined from there, and it eventually it'll become Turkey. But that's not important right now. So we see the rise of the Habsburgs in Austria and the rise of Prussia, which is the Hohenzollerns. And so the Habsburgs in Austria, so the Habsburgs lost power after the 30 Years' War, and they gained Spain, Netherlands, Italian territories, and Germanic territories. So you see Emperor Charles IV, he didn't have a male heir, and so he made the pragmatic sanction to help secure Maria Theresa's inheritance of the Holy Roman throne. And so the pragmatic sanction, it was completely useless. Everyone signed it, but everyone just ignored it in history to come. So in the Hohenzollern Prussia, so the Hohenzollerns were very important in the Holy Roman Empire. They had a lot of territory, and they were very wealthy nobles. So Frederick William, he united his land and armed his soldiers. He gained loyalty of the Junkers, who were German landowners. And Frederick William I, he doubled the army, which was really significant because I believe that they had one of the biggest armies in Europe and the smallest population in Europe at the time. So they have a really military-centric state at the time, and it'll stay that way for a while. All right, so Russia. We don't talk about Russia most of the time, but so it was because it was isolated from Europe. And so we saw the rise of the Romanov dynasty, which was created in 1613. And so Peter the Great, he toured Europe to modernize Russia. He went all around Europe trying to figure out what all the powers did well, and he tried to bring that to Russia. So he defeated Sweden in 1721, which the biggest thing that you probably need to know about Russia is that they wanted a warm water port. Yeah, so this was like their goal in life. Like this was their main thing that they wanted to do. Get a warm water port. Make sure you remember that because that's important. So St. Petersburg in 1703 was built to honor the Romanov dynasty, and it was made to be the new capital. And it's effectively the Versailles of Russia, even though no one ever calls it that. But it's like you can compare it to Versailles in France. So the boyars were made to shave beards. That's probably the biggest thing that you'll remember. But what that means is that he wanted them to be more westernized instead of their original traditional Russian heritage. They wanted them to be more westernized. So the commoners, they did not enjoy the benefits of Peter's various reforms, which it's just important to know that the commoners did not benefit from any of these reforms. All right, and so that's the end of Unit 3. Again, we have the same key concepts right here. So right now we're going to start delving into the scientific, philosophical, and political developments. Again, if you can, just keep these in the back of your head. They're just the big ideas. They'll be important, but they'll be important. Keep them in the back of your head. All right, so the scientific revolution, it really started with astronomy. So geocentrism was supported by the Catholic Church, Aristotle, and Ptolemy, which is a lot of authority to put on one scientific idea. So with all these people supporting it, it made it think like it was the only idea and it was completely correct. And so this was the idea that the Earth was the center of the universe and everything, the stars, the sun, orbited that. And so Nicholas Copernicus, he actually debunked this theory, and he said that heliocentrism was based on logic and reason, and he said that heliocentrism with the sun at the center of the solar system, that was what was actually real. And so Johann Kepler, he observed elliptical orbits, and planets would move faster when they're close to the sun. So later we see these connections with Newton. So he actually used Kepler's ideas to formulate his mathematical descriptions of physics. And we also see Galileo. He revolutionized the lens, whom he heard about from, I believe, a Dutchman, and he built it himself. He revolutionized it. He found that the sun had spots. Jupiter had moons. He said 4 at the time, but there's actually a lot more. He said that Saturn had rings and that the moon was rough and uneven compared to the idea at the time that it was smooth and perfectly spherical. The Catholic Church, they were not very fond of Galileo. They found his findings sacrilegious and made him apologize in the Inquisitions. So he didn't really oblige with that. So he was put under house arrest in his final years, which is really sad when you think about it. But yeah. So the scientific method, we see the rise of Sir Francis Bacon and René Descartes. So Sir Francis Bacon advocated for the inductive method, which is the observation of phenomena, and then you formulate a theory or hypothesis off of that. And so René Descartes, he advocated for the deductive method, which was doubting of all notions based on authority. So when we combined those together, we made the scientific method, which we still use today, which is insanely revolutionary. This completely started the entire scientific revolution, and we still use it today. So yeah, just lots of revolutions in science and industry have been made using the scientific method. And so just as a side note, so the scientists of the time, they worked to find reason behind nature in order to support God and religion. Their main intentions were not to go against religion, which is sometimes what you may think or infer. So they really aimed to reinforce it. Like I believe either Descartes or Bacon tried to use psychology to prove that God exists. So they really just want to support God. All right, so here we get to talk about Isaac Newton again. You've probably heard his name millions of times. So he published Principia, which it combined a lot of theories from like Kepler, for example, to create a mathematical law for universal gravitation, which in English basically just means like he wanted to describe nature through math. And he created mathematical laws to describe all motion. If you're taking physics, you know that Newton is extremely important to all motion. And he had 3 laws, and he dominated Western thought until the rise of Albert Einstein, which is going to be in World War II. So you don't need to worry about that right now. All right, and so along with this scientific revolution, we really see this political revolution, which we know as the Enlightenment. So what would be the scientists in the scientific revolution? We would call the philosophes in the Enlightenment. So they wanted to create social reform based off of natural laws. And so they said that reason was the absence of intolerance, bigotry, and superstition, that society was based off of natural laws, similar to the ones in science. So misery was often accepted and encouraged throughout the medieval times, and they said that it was no longer necessary. You need to lead a happy life. And so that was really that inspired the commoners to really get behind this cause. So he had the idea of social and political progress, which we haven't seen before, and no limitations on liberty, which is another thing that we haven't seen before. And so the philosophes, they all advocated for full religious tolerance, and the many elites embraced deism, which was kind of a step away from Christianity at the time. So it's like a counter-religious movement to pietism, which was a religious movement at the time that encouraged religion. Excuse me. So principles and founding of the United States of America, where you are right now, this would be the first nation to embrace Enlightenment ideals fully, as we can see in the Constitution. You'll learn next year everything behind America. But I don't know if it's necessarily important, but you can definitely draw that connection to America being the British colonies and being some of the first to use the Enlightenment ideals in government. So here's some of your philosophes. So we have Voltaire up here, and he wrote plays originally, and he was from France, I believe. So he popularized Newton's discoveries, and he criticized French government, which was big at the time because it was very absolutist. And so he denounced the religious bigotry, like the shunning of non-Christian people, non-Catholic people, especially in France. He actually advocated for the crushing of religion entirely. His famous quote is "crush the infamous thing." I don't know what it is in French, but he said it in French. So this was directed towards Christianity, which was not the most tolerant at the time. So another person is Denis Diderot. I could be saying that wrong, but anyways, he wrote the encyclopedia, and he wanted to bring everything that we know together into one collection. So here's a collection of an encyclopedia. And so he disseminated enlightened thinking all around Europe, and he undermined established authority by disseminating this knowledge. So yeah, and here's some more philosophers. So we have Baron de Montesquieu right here. So he was mainly a political philosopher. He wanted to limit royal absolutism. He wanted to create social sciences by applying natural laws to politics, which was really interesting at the time. So he wrote The Spirit of the Laws, and his main theory was the theory of checks and balances. You want to separate the three branches of government by executive, judicial, and legislative to all check each other's power. And then we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau over here. So he wrote Emile and the Social Contract. He said that natural education should be available to all. Students should be able to draw their own conclusions, kind of more modern education, kind of like what we're seeing now. They're trying to teach you how instead of what I would describe it as. So he was one of the first people to say that children develop in stages and that they're not all the same throughout their lives. And that everyone, when they get into society, they enter a social contract with everyone that is around them. And they say that the general will is anything good and right for all. So he really advocated for the absolutist rulers to really go for the general will of the people, because it would be good for politics, economy, and their self-image. So yeah, he advocated for rulers to serve the people and their community. All right, and so in another way, we have economics. So there was a new theory of laissez-faire. Adam Smith, he came up with it. He wrote The Wealth of Nations, and he's really the backbone of capitalist thinking and the capitalist economic policies that we use today in America and most developed countries. So he's really the forefront of modern economics. So the government should not interfere with the economy. They should have a limited role. So he wanted government completely out, very libertarian ideologies. And he said that this would stimulate the economies and make massive economic growth. And so this was supported by the laws of supply and demand, and that will regulate the market. And so how he described these laws of supply and demand to everyone is he said that invisible hand will regulate the market. So people can use their purchasing power to influence companies. They can invest. They can this really gives people a play in the economy, whereas they didn't have it before in the mercantilist policies. Just to outline, he was basically the father of capitalism, and that's what we use today in America. All right, so another topic is women in the Enlightenment. So we saw that liberty and equality should be extended to women because they really weren't at the time. But there was still division over this concept of women having liberty and equality. Some said that there were natural differences and that the public sphere should be for men and the private sphere should be for women. But some people said that women should concentrate on being wives and mothers. However, other people like Mary Wollstonecraft and a bit later Olympe de Gouges, I don't know if that's how you say that either, that's French. They started to advocate for equality of opportunity and equality and liberty in general for women, which was pretty revolutionary and sadly considered radical at the time. All right. So overall characteristics of the 18th century was that monarchy was really still prevalent, and especially divine right monarchy. It started to shift into more enlightened despotism. I know you guys have heard the term enlightened despots, which were the enlightened rulers that were also absolutist. And so the aristocrats, they also gained influence with the slow decline of absolutism. All right, so we see the shift in the balance of power. So England and France really begin dominating. So the great powers fought no religious wars, and they fought with strategy instead of sheer manpower. So they're not just throwing soldiers at the other side, they're fighting with strategy. So yeah, we really see this period of peace and prosperity between 1715 and 1740. So Britain was the most dominant at this time. The upper classes gained a lot of status everywhere with the new economic policies, capitalism. So we saw Robert Walpole. He became the first prime minister of England. He was a Whig to replace the Hanovers. And in France, Louis XV was extremely weak, especially compared to Louis XIV. He was very easily influenced by people like his mistresses. And Louis XVI, he actually allowed nobles to gain power. And France was in a lot of debt at the time. So France wasn't doing so hot. All right, and we're just going to continue this idea. So there was a whole nother period of warfare from 1740 to 1763. So we see Prussia and Austria, they were both fighting for dominance in Central Europe. And while England and France, they both fought for trade in North America with the fur trade in the French Canada and Louisiana Territory, and in North America in general with British and France. And so we see this War of Austrian Succession from 1740 to 1748. So Frederick the Great of Prussia, he completely ignored the pragmatic sanction, like I was saying before. He took the Holy Roman Empire's Silesia, I believe it's Austria at this point, and he took Silesia. And so he got French support while England supported Austria, because France and Britain were very against each other and they would do anything to support the opposite. Like France supported the American Revolution, while Britain was fighting against France and the American Revolution. So we see that the Americans took French forts in Canada, French Canada, Louisiana's territory, and France actually took Madras in India. So we see kind of this being fought in colonies along with Europe. So the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle gave Silesia to Prussia, which is important, and Madras and forts were given back to each other. So there wasn't really too much given away in the colonies. And again, we see the 7 Years' War. It started, so Austria started to regain Silesia. They wanted to, and so they fought, so the 7 Years' War, it was fought in America with the French, the Indians, and the British. You'll learn more about that in APUSH. And in the West Indies and India, Prussia became the main victor as Russia dropped out of the fight. So Prussia was fighting against this giant coalition of just everyone, except for Britain. Britain was with Prussia, which was insane because Prussia was such a small country with such a small population. I believe it was Voltaire that said that something along the lines of Prussia is not a state with an army, but an army with a state, or something along those lines. So they're very, very military centric. And so we see the Treaty of Paris in 1763. This actually gave Britain the land in America from France. The France got their sugar islands back in the West Indies and their trading posts along India or close to India, because India was under British rule. And Prussia got to keep Silesia, which is very important. So we see again this enlightened despotism of the rulers, the very powerful rulers. And so the philosophes pressured the absolute rulers to govern for the betterment of the people. Again, we see this idea of the general will. So they wanted to combat religious intolerance, which was very rampant at the time. Really, Christianity, if anything, was the only religion that people were tolerant of, and usually it was either Protestant or Catholic. And those two sects of Christianity still conflicted with each other a lot. So they fought against intolerance, superstition, ignorance, and any other malice like racism and stuff. So the philosophers, they really did not support democracy despite popular belief. And they said that the people can't be trusted with government, because a lot of people at the time were not educated, and a lot did not even know how to read, which we'll see change. I don't believe in this unit, but later. Some rulers, they didn't want enlightened despotism. Like in Britain, they didn't care at all. Where am I going? Okay, yeah. So we see some examples of enlightened despots in Russia with Catherine the Great. So she invited Voltaire, and she was kind of like pen pals with Diderot. So she really supported printing presses, which were not very rampant in Russia at the time. And she advocated for more education of the daughters of nobles, less torture, not complete abolition of torture, religious toleration for Jewish people. They drafted a new enlightened law code, which unfortunately was not ratified by the nobles. So one thing that really influenced Catherine the Great was Pugachev's rebellion in 1773. This really scared Catherine from doing more enlightened reform, because so she was scared of the common people, that she was giving too much power to them. So she gave more power to herself and the nobles to try and prevent them from creating another insurrection. So overall, she made government really efficient. She had a really good image, and she rejected radical ideals of the commoners. Another person is Frederick the Great of Prussia. I know the Fredericks are very confusing in Prussia. So this guy is also known as Frederick II. And so he was the first to say that he was the servant of the state. So he was also friends with Voltaire. He invited him to stay at his palace. He advocated for scientific agriculture and a unified code of law. He actually created a unified code of law. He also said less torture, but not the complete abolition of it. And he said he advocated for the religious toleration of Christians and Jews. And so he gave the Junkers more privileges, and serfdom was unfortunately still a reality. You probably know, but serfdom is like the European version of slavery. And one interesting fun fact about him was that he played the flute. People said he was really good, but it's hard to know if he was actually good or if people just didn't want to get beheaded. So the other enlightened despot that we'll talk about is Joseph II. So he actually abolished serfdom and forced labor. He said that religious toleration for all Christians and Jews, less influence of the church, abolished torture and the death penalty. So this guy, he's really modern in his thought. So you can imagine he was extremely radical at the time, and he made nobles very concerned. So after he died, Leopold II, he actually repealed almost all of his reforms and made it back to before he governed. Just so the nobles wouldn't start an insurrection similar to Pugachev's rebellion. All right, and again, we see the agricultural revolution. So traditional agriculture did not have any fences, and so we had a 2 to 3 system of crop rotation, and animals could really graze anywhere because they had very long, vertical, narrow farmland, I guess you could say. So the Low Countries, like the Dutch Republic and England, they really led the agricultural revolution because they had a really dense population and a high demand, therefore, for food and other plant products. So we see the enclosure movement start to build up, and the idea of continuous crop rotation, the use of fertilizers, a different variety of crops like the potato, and drainage systems. I believe it's Edward Townsend, but anyway, Townshend of England, he proposed a system of crop rotation, while Jethro Tull, he invented the seed drill, which is up here. And Robert Bakewell, he pioneered the selective breeding of animals and livestock. So we saw, as a result of this, an explosion of population throughout Europe. And this was a result of because of the potato from North America, revolutions in transportation, which made famines less effective in destroying populations. And the wars were really less destructive at the time because they didn't involve civilians as much. And so we saw also medical advancement, some of the first vaccines, like for what was it? I want to say smallpox. It wasn't an actual vaccine. It would like, anyway, it's kind of disgusting, but medical advancement happened. And again, capitalism, and we saw less civil wars happening too, which was very important. All right. So life in the 18th century was really around the nuclear family. So this means like a husband, a wife, and maybe 2 or 3 kids, sometimes more, usually more, with the income. So they got more income, and so there were less arranged marriages, which was interesting. And women worked as domestic servants in other people's households, and they began to start working outside of their household, which was also very important for the rights of women. So Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he actually advised parents to be more caring towards their children, because the lower class people really weren't that loving and caring towards their children because they feared them getting too attached and then them dying, which would be detrimental for their mental health. So we saw the lifespan increase from 25 to 35 years actually in Europe. And again, this was because of the potato, medical care, agricultural advancement, better farming, transportation, you name it. Less civil wars too. All right. And another important idea, you'll probably not need to know this as much, but witchcraft was kind of popular in a certain period. So around 100 to 200,000 people were actually tried for witchcraft, and 40 to 60,000 of those people were killed for being witches. It was usually elderly women, and widows that were the most common to be tried. So we saw along with the religious movements, it stressed the power and diabolicalness of the devil. So people were really afraid of the devil. And so they believed that women were the most susceptible, and they believed that women were weak emotionally, which is obviously not true that we know nowadays. But that's what they believed, and they believed that they were susceptible to the ideas of Satan and the devil. So the decline began with the end of religious wars. This is the decline of witchcraft in general. So we saw this Protestant definition of a supreme God, which also started to make the idea of witchcraft less threatening, and enlightened discoveries that describe the natural world. They also started to cause this sort of shift away from religion. Don't get me wrong, religion was still extremely important in Europe at the time, but it was just, as we discovered more and more, it was just slightly less powerful. All right, so artistic styles in this time, there were multiple and they're very important. So we know Rococo. It peaked during Louis XV's reign. It was very kind of lighthearted, painting ceilings, usually nobles. I think they would say like nobles at play is how I would describe it. So some key artists are Antoine Watteau, again, a French word, I suck at French, Francois Boucher, and Jan Honoré Fragonard. And we also see a neoclassical movement, which is a little bit more, it emphasizes heroism, and it's full of virtue and self-sacrifice for the state. There's these Greek ideals of restraint, simplicity, symmetry, and again, heroism that we see, which is really important. So this actually replaced Rococo in the 1780s. And some key artists were Jacques-Louis David, Jean-Antoine Houdon, and actually Thomas Jefferson. It's really interesting that Thomas Jefferson is there. He's there because of his house, Monticello. It was very neoclassical. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a picture, but you all probably know what it looks like. All right, so here's an example of Rococo. So this is called Cupid, a Captive by Francois Boucher. And so we can see kind of this really lighthearted painting that's just really happy. It makes you happy. And it's just, I guess, a very joyful painting. And then over here, we see Voltaire Seated by Jean-Antoine Houdon. And this is more neoclassical. We see this, again, these like sculptures. I don't know if it's a marble sculpture, but it's Voltaire. He's sitting down with like, he's definitely old, but you can definitely sense that he's very smart. So yeah, it's full of virtue, and that's what the neoclassical period is all about. All right, so that pretty much sums it up for the units 1 through 4. So we just have a few tips for you, the format of the final, tips and tricks. So as you guys probably have heard multiple times throughout your classes, so the final is going to be 55 stimulus-based multiple choice questions. And typically the answers will have 2 that are clearly wrong and 2 that could be the right answer. And so when that happens, you really have to look at words with really high connotations, because those could be the giveaway of, okay, this is not the right answer. And that's just a general description of the multiple choice questions. Not every one is like that. So yeah, if you have no idea what a question is, or if it's just confusing to read, skip it immediately and come back to it if you have time. Chances are you will have more success if you just skip it and do the ones that you think are easier. And so again, do not waste time, because I believe you'll have 55 minutes. So that's 1 minute per question, and you have to read all those sources. So definitely make sure you're acquainted with your sources. You know, go back, read your HTSs, key concepts, and just recollect all the sources that you had to read. Yeah. Oh, and one last thing that I wanted to say, trust yourself, positive self-talk, tell yourself that you can do it. Confidence is key. Just even if you don't believe it, keep telling yourself, I am going to do amazing on this final, and I promise you it'll help you so much. So here's some advice from your teachers that I got. So Mr. Spears says that before the final, students should review their notes, their primary sources, and HTSs. So I was actually in Mr. Spears's class, and I know that definitely reading over my notes was important, but the most important thing for me was reading the primary sources, because that's stimulus-based multiple choice. And then we have Mr. Lind. He says that reviewing the Renaissance and Reformation would probably be a great help to students, because that was a longer time away. I don't know if Ethan, you have anything to say about what helped you with Mr. Lind, but yeah, review the Renaissance and Reformation. Make sure to review all the material that you may have forgotten. Feel free to ask us questions and have us go over any slides again. And most importantly, good luck on your final. If it's tomorrow or Thursday, good luck. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and...
Thank you.